The way to turn your operations team into a revenue driving part of the organization is to have them focused on making high quality, consistent product that's shipped on time, and not to have them spending endless hours just trying to play phone tag and email tag with different vendors across the world to coordinate the movement, production, and ultimately fulfillment of inventory. So the biggest thing that many merchants get wrong is thinking of quality as a reactive function instead of a proactive part of what you need to do. Many brands wait till there's a huge product recall or a container of damaged inventory before they start to institute a quality program.
Welcome to Blue Ocean by StartOps. Each episode, I sit down with leaders in consumer brand supply chain, finance, and CX to talk about the problems they're facing and the solutions they're using or building. I hope you enjoy the show. Hey everyone, I'm Charles Cushing, founder of StartOps. With me here today is Prince Ghosh, CEO of Factored Quality. Welcome, Prince.
Thanks, Charles. Excited to do this.
So just to kick us off, can you give us the one-liner on what Factored Quality does, just so everyone has context as we go into the episode?
Factored Quality is a digital quality management platform for consumer goods brands to help ensure they're manufacturing high-quality inventory that is compliant from anywhere in the world.
I want to spend most of this talking about your company in the space. Do you mind just running through your quick background? Like, what was the path that led you to running a quality control platform?
I was actually a mechanical and aerospace engineer. I started my career in the aerospace industry, originally working across a number of aerospace and defense suppliers. And when I was working in the aerospace industry, I had this idea of, hey, like, what if there was an easier way for buyers? And that's kind of the side of the supply chain that I sat on to make it easier to work and collaborate with suppliers, all the folks that were actually manufacturing all the parts and products that we were ultimately buying. As I was doing that, I had this kind of idea. I ended up leaving my job to go and start a company called Workbench. And the entire idea was that would be this collaborative platform for manufacturing and product development and quality. Went from kind of one industry to the next, trying to find a beachhead in, right? They had the entire thought or idea was that, hey, look, I've seen this at kind of one of the largest aerospace entities in the world. What if you could do the same thing for every other company that was operating between these buyer and supplier relationships? Ultimately, it turns out that selling software into aerospace defense while looking for almost product market fit with that initial company. At one point, Workbench ended up becoming a product development and manufacturing platform for the consumer goods industry. And I ended up meeting a team out of New York called Doris Dev, which is a product design, development, and supply chain management agency. So think of them as kind of like a VP of ops in a box. They help consumer brands of all shapes and sizes. Almost every major direct-to-consumer e-commerce brand that you've probably heard of has worked with them at some point or the other to either design a new product, to source a factory, to develop that product, to run production, manufacturing, to run quality, and then to run shipping and logistics. So to basically bring that product to life and then import that product into the US. And the Doris Dev team, they were actually customers of ours. When we were building Workbench, they were early design partners, early customers. And at one point, we had this kind of realization of saying, hey, if you think about all the different parts of what goes into developing and manufacturing a product, there's this one really kind of critical piece around quality that every brand on earth goes through. And the Doris Dev team, one of the services that they offered, which was really popular for a number of brands, was actually running quality control and running quality management as a service. So at one point, we realized there was a really interesting opportunity to kind of merge and join forces and take the software that we had built at Workbench, combine it with the managed services layer that Doris Dev had built, and turn that into what is ultimately Factored Quality. So that's kind of the journey over the last number of years for me.
I mean, it's interesting that your software sort of found a home with the services business. Like, have you seen anyone out there kind of take the original pure software like vision for Workbench and run with it?
I have a bunch of thoughts about this. And the first part is the product category that Workbench kind of falls into is something called a PLM. And what you kind of learn after enough time in the supply chain space is every piece of software or service infrastructure that you buy kind of falls into a 3-letter acronym bucket. It almost feels like a religious rite of passage. And then, every now and then people try to invent new phrases and new 4-letter, 3-letter acronyms. And everything ultimately kind of converges down to one of these buckets. There's actually reasons why, right? It's because when you think about selling software into a business, all of the people who are buying the software, be it brands, importers, retailers, manufacturers, they all structure everything based on their budgets. And in their budget, when they think about their COGS or they think about their OPEX, they always think about, hey, what is the software spend that I have for my PLM? What am I spending on my ERP? What am I spending on my QMS, on my MRP? So anyway, point being, there are definitely a couple of players in the space that have tried to build next generation PLMs. Probably most popular version of this is a company called Centric Software, has built a bunch of different PLM modules for different verticals. But one of the big things that we realized was in the supply chain space, especially if you are trying to build a next generation version of these 3-letter acronyms, unless you build for almost years in isolation and build such massive product surface area, it's almost impossible to wedge yourself into an organization from day one building pure software. The way to wedge yourself into an organization from day one, if you don't want to spend 5 years building out an entire suite of products to reach product parity with an incumbent, is to actually wedge yourself in by actually doing the work for a brand, right? So you've seen this over the last 10 years in categories like shipping and logistics, where companies like Flexport, are actually the freight forwarder or the freight partner of choice for these brands. And companies like Stored and ShipBob that are actually the fulfillment and 3PL partner of choice for these brands. And then you have a few folks in the inventory side, and then we are trying to do this on the quality control, regulatory, and compliance side.
Let's just reel back to like day zero at Factored Quality. You guys spun out of Doris Dev effectively. What did your first customer transaction look like?
That's a great question. So one of the big advantages that we had spinning out of Doris Dev was we had a network of brands that Doris Dev was serving across all of their different service capabilities that could kind of be our initial design partners. And I think this was a really big hack for us when building companies. There's always this question of how do you kind of get your first 10 users? And I think that honestly, the easiest way is by knowing them personally. And it's really hard to kind of get, your first 10 users if you're just sending cold emails out into the ether. You don't have really brand recognition in the space. You're building something new, something untested. So the best way to do it is to go to people that already trust you for kind of something else, right? Either their personal friends, their colleagues. You hear that as kind of founding stories all the time for different companies. So for us, we had a network of, dozens of brands that Doris Dev was working with that we could basically go back and say, hey, this quality service thing that we've been doing for you guys, in kind of a manual way over emails and PDFs and phone calls and Zoom calls back and forth. What if we could digitize it? What if we can make it a really simple and easy to use platform where you could actually book quality anywhere in the world? You could actually track where the status of your inspection or your audit or your test is. And then you could actually see all of the final results digitized. And as you started using this platform for long enough, we would actually pull out a bunch of the data that was stuck in these PDFs and we would give you insights. So we would actually be able to tell you, hey, we think you have a product quality issue at one of your factories because every time we inspect inventory that's manufactured at that factory, we see a defect. Or, hey, one of your suppliers is about to go out of compliance with federal regulation because their certification for a certain type of audit is about to expire. Ultimately, it was kind of a data problem that we were fundamentally solving between the relationship of brands, their suppliers, and factories across the world, and their quality information. But we knew we had to run QC as a service, or actually run the service of running quality control to be able to get that data, to be able to give that to the brand. So anyway, on day zero, we went to a bunch of the Doris Dev customer base. We went to a bunch of the Workbench customer base that we had been working with as well. And we said, hey, we're doing this thing. And when you first start, you sell typically in the supply chain space to kind of emerging brands. So the early D2C sort of brands where they oftentimes don't have a ton of operational muscle and you end up becoming pretty service heavy in terms of helping them actually run this function or run this process. And that's what we did. And then over time, as you get a couple of data points, you start kind of shooting your shot a bit more. For us, I remember some of the early design partners that were kind of those day zero adopters. But then I also remember some of the early folks who were larger, more prominent brands that took a bet on us, folks that I had known from Workbench days or before. And ultimately, you kind of put one foot in front of the other until it snowballs. And that's when you have a real company with a real customer base in front of you.
I love this idea of almost like drafting off the reputation of an existing company that's already providing the service, or even just your own connections.
It's pretty funny when you look at kind of a lot of the softwares that have done well. Actually, there's a backstory behind many of them that very few people know. And it's that they typically are either born out of an agency or actually born out of a brand, out of necessity itself. Another example that I can think of is Loop Returns, the return logistics management software, was actually born out of a need out of Chubbies, the men's shorts company. And the founders of Chubbies were building kind of this returns management platform for Chubbies. There was none at that time. And they had an agency building it. And they basically came together with that agency and they said, hey, what if we took this and we turn it into an independent company? How many other, companies in the world would need something like this? So you see this concept of companies being born out of necessity. You see this story pretty repeated over and over again.
You think almost in a way that like B2B would be less organic because, some MBA could sit there and map out the market and see where the gaps are and go in. But I almost feel like, to your point, a lot of the time it's just like, hey, someone had an insight and then had a need and they went in and built a solution.
I think there's actually a really important emotional reason as to why that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. A supply chain for a physical product company is effectively just an outsourced part of their own core team. Like once upon a time, there was a world where the brand also owned the manufacturer, also owned the warehouse, also owned the trucks that would move the goods from point A to point B. And over time, over the last 100 years or so, brands, importers realized that there was a lot of value to slowly kind of outsourcing multiple parts of that process. You would outsource your production to a contract manufacturer. You would outsource your logistics to a 3PL or to a 4PL. You would outsource your quality control to a vendor like us, and you would outsource your fulfillment to a warehousing partner. But you have to remember that's kind of like in a software company, outsourcing your product engineering, design, development, DevOps to offshore labor or to outside of your own team. So when you think about choosing a partner in that space, the level of trust that you have to have is astronomical. And I think that's a big part that's ignored, is just like, there's such a huge portion of it of saying, hey, we're going to actually do this critical part of your process for you. And if we screw up, it's your inventory that's on the line. Like, I think that's why folks who kind of come from insider bases in the industry have such an outsized advantage in going to market and getting, those early critical first end users.
Let's take a quick dive into the product. What can you do on the Factored Quality platform today, just sort of at a high level?
Factored Quality is a booking and management and intelligence platform for consumer goods brands, again, to run quality control across their global supply chains. So brands come into Factored Quality and they book inspections, audits, or tests across the world at their supply chains. This can be anything from a pre-shipment inspection as goods are being manufactured on a factory floor before they're loaded onto a container and ultimately shipped into the US. Or this can be an audit of the actual factory for anything from an ISO certification standard all the way to a good manufacturing practice standard or GMP audit. This can be product testing. This can be anything from a performance or reliability test that we run for the brands, or it can be a chemical test, an ingredient composition, etc., where we actually take care of sending the products from the factories all across the world to a outsourced third-party lab. Brands through the Factored Quality platform can actually book and manage that entire process. And then ultimately, at the end of the inspection or audit or test, we take all of the final results, we digitize those for brands, and we structure those in a really easy way for them to understand, to make critical decisions about production and about shipping or not shipping inventory. And then we actually, over time, analyze that data. So we tell brands, hey, we're noticing trends or we're noticing patterns across these factories or across ABC SKUs that you're manufacturing. So that's kind of the brand side. We, on the other side, have this network of thousands of inspectors and auditors and third-party labs. And we have over time also built software for them. So we built management software for them to intake the kind of booking request, to run the entire process. We're starting to roll out our inspector app across a large part of our inspector workforce, boots on the ground. And ultimately, the goal of us is to digitize every part of that quality journey for both the brands and then also for the vendors who are actually running quality as a service.
I want to just dig a little bit deeper on the inspector side. On the site, it says you've got more than 2,000 inspectors in 28 countries. How did you find these people? And who inspects the inspectors? Like, how do you know that someone you're partnering with is actually going to be doing a good job?
Great question. So there's two parts to this. Quality control is not a new industry. Quality control has been around for, as long as manufacturing has been around, and specifically third-party quality control, which is the act of sending someone, an external third party, to a factory to inspect the products or audit the factory or test the products is also not new. There's hundreds of companies in the space. If you Googled quality control Shenzhen today, you would come up with a list of 50 different vendors that offer quality control services. So we're not reinventing a category. We are just for the first time building an easier way for consumer goods brands to find trusted and vetted quality control vendors. And we're building kind of the data and orchestration layer for the industry. The way to think about it is in freight, for example, as an importer, you could work potentially directly with a carrier. The role of freight forwarder like Flexport plays is to serve as that orchestration layer one level above so that you don't need to go and directly interact with a dozen different carriers to get your goods from point A to point B to point C. We do the same thing because the big sort of pain point we realized was brands were using 5, 6, 7 different vendors across every single production run to a different vendor to audit the factory. Ultimately, this became the value proposition of Factored Quality. When we first started, we had a small network of folks that my co-founders at Doris Dev had worked with just by virtue of doing this for years as a pure service. And we basically went to those folks and we said, hey, we're building this platform. We want you to be kind of early vendors on our network. And they were on board. And over time, we built an operations team whose entire job is to go and aggregate new vendors in different regions to verify them, to qualify them. We've built software that makes it really easy to actually ensure the quality of the quality that we're running. And we built a lot of practices in place around, fraud detection, et cetera, to make sure that inspectors aren't getting bribed by factories and signing off on inventory. And then over time, we've just managed to digitize and turn this into a bit of a network. And today we cover 28 countries across dozens of product categories, dozens of different types of inspections, audits, and tests. And that's kind of what's led us to where we are now.
Was that the hardest part of building the business, would you say, so far? Or what's been the biggest stumbling block that you've had to overcome on the road to where you are now?
Factored Quality is a operationally intensive business. Even before we built software, we were actually running quality as a service, right? And so there's kind of this constant back and forth that you almost go through of building out more and more operations, automating those operations, building out operations, automating those operations, building more software for the brands, building more software for the vendors, the inspectors, auditors, and testing labs. So over time, as we just kind of race back and forth between building them, I think constantly managing that process of what do you build for the brand today? Do you build for the vendors today? Do you focus on growing top line? Do you focus on optimizing operations? That's a big part of what makes this so challenging, but ultimately that's a big part of also what makes it so worth it. You don't make money doing easy things, and Factored Quality is definitely not an easy business to build, but it's an incredibly valuable business that deserves to exist in the world, and that's why we do it.
To your point, not an easy business to build. Also not an easy business to build is like a new ERP, right?
Sure.
Huge product surface area. It takes years and years to build a new one. And yet you see dozens, if not hundreds of teams kind of going after new ERP right now. I don't really know of that many other people trying to push the boundaries in the quality space. Why do you think that is?
I think there's 2 reasons. One is ERP is kind of an existing category. And I think in general, it's always a little bit easier to kind of try and build into a category that already exists because you don't have to generate demand and kind of create the market for the first time. You can kind of go to the list of all the folks who use NetSuite or SAP, and you can go down the list and say, hey, you should come and try our new ERP. So I think that's one piece of it, is from a commercial and go-to-market standpoint. We had to kind of build an industry. Before us, digital quality control was not really an industry. Quality control was an industry, but digital quality control was not really an industry. We kind of pioneered this category, and now we see a couple of other folks trying to do the same. And then I think the second piece is this is a problem that you can't solve with just software. Very similar to shipping and logistics, very similar to fulfillment. Just having better visibility into the movement of these goods is not enough to actually provide value. You actually have to do something. You actually have to be the service provider or be the vendor for these companies. In the ERP space, ERPs fundamentally are systems of record of financial sources of truth. And they over time have expanded into becoming operations systems of records, and to a certain extent, operations workflow tools as well. Because it turns out that when you place the purchase order, that's when the entire financial accounting for that inventory actually starts. So you can't really pull apart or decouple the operation suite from the financial suite, but fundamentally, there is a regulatory, at the very least, need for ERPs to exist, which is to understand how much money you're paying out and how much money you're making, and then how much tax you need to file for it. So I think that's why ERPs have always kind of existed as a category and why there's a lot of attraction to building in that category. But quality, shipping, logistics, fulfillment, manufacturing, like these are hard, messy problems that require real world interaction of atoms, not just bits. And I think that's what makes it, again, hard, but that's, again, what makes it so worth it and so sticky if you can do it right.
And so to your point, this is kind of a new category, digital quality, not really done widely before. So when you go into a sales meeting with a brand and give your pitch for the first time, what does the alternative look like? And when someone says no to you today, like what are the reasons that you're hearing back still?
The alternative for us is really the status quo. So when we go to a sales meeting, we basically go into a brand and we say, hey, look, how are you running your supply chain today? Where are you sourcing from? And a scaling brand will say, look, we're sourcing from, 15, 20 suppliers all across the world, across like 12 different countries, and we're manufacturing 2,000 different SKUs. And then we say, how are you running quality today? And usually they'll say, we have 3 vendors for audits, 2 vendors for inspections, and 4 vendors for testing across different parts of the world. And we say, okay, great. And who is actually running all that coordination and orchestration process? And they say, we have a team of quality and production managers whose entire job is just to coordinate from point A to point B to point C as these inspections, audits, and tests are run. And we say to them, hey, what if your quality team could spend less time playing email and PDF tag with all these different vendors between your factories, between your production teams in-house, and then between these quality control vendors? And what if instead they could spend more time thinking about new products to launch and spend more time thinking about, hey, I know what are the quality issues across my supply chain. How can I actually improve those quality issues so that I can stop churning customers because I'm spending all this money to acquire a customer and then I'm sending, Charles or Prince like a shirt with a hole in it that's torn and, we're losing them as customers. So the way that we always think about it is with Factored Quality, we make it incredibly easy for brands to run a comprehensive quality, regulatory, and compliance program and spend less time coordinating quality and more time actually thinking about how to improve quality.
You have just such a huge wealth of knowledge about quality in this space. I want to see if I can, pull a few other lessons out of you while I've got you here. First question to ask is, when you embed with the team for the first time and sort of look at what they're doing, are there any patterns of like things that you see merchants getting wrong when it comes to quality control? Like anything, if someone's listening to this and they're thinking about their own quality operation, that like they could go take a look and see if, this is an area that might need attention.
I think the biggest thing that many merchants get wrong is thinking of quality as a reactive function instead of a proactive part of what you need to do. Many brands wait till there's a huge product recall or a container damaged inventory before they start to institute a quality program. And oftentimes by that time, it's too late. You've burned the relationship with the customer. You have burned inventory that is, precious cash that's on your balance sheet. That's a problem. And the brands that we've seen to be the most successful are the ones who take a proactive perspective of quality, or the ones who think of quality not as a nice to have, but think of it as a need to have. And ultimately, in many product categories, especially in regulated product categories like food, beverage, beauty, cosmetics, kids, babies, toys, furniture, quality and regulatory is not a nice to have. It is a absolute need to have to be able to distribute your product to retailers, to be able to sell your product in certain countries or certain geographies. The second kind of problem that many brands have is their solution to the space is just throwing people at the problem and just saying, hey, look, we're just going to add more and more operations headcount. And ultimately, I love operations teams, but it's really important for especially CEOs and leaders of brands to remember that your operations team is not necessarily a revenue driving part of the organization. And it's just kind of a very real part of life and how brands run. The way to turn your operations team into a revenue driving part of the organization is to have them focused on making high quality, consistent product that's shipped on time, and not to have them spending endless hours just trying to play phone tag and email tag with different vendors across the world to coordinate the movement, production, and ultimately fulfillment of inventory. So tapping into third-party resources, I think, is super, super valuable. The ones that are digitally enabled and can integrate with your other solutions in your supply chain stack becomes super, super valuable because you remove the need for hours spent just coordinating between your purchase order management tools and your freight forwarders and your quality management platforms and your fulfillment platforms. So I think those are kind of the biggest things to think about.
You guys just put out a really interesting guide about product recalls, which is a space that I didn't know much about before reading it, but it was really cool. 2 questions I have from that. How inevitable is it that a brand has a recall? Is it something that could actually be avoided?
I think the answer is a little bit of both. Mistakes in production and mistakes with the product safety or integrity of your product are inevitable. Those are part of, life and part of production. Even if you have the strictest quality control measures at point of production, your goods may ultimately get damaged in transit. They may get damaged in a shipping container. There may always be some instance where you may need to recall a product, and it might be self-driven by the brand to say, hey, we've seen a couple of complaints. This is not regulatory oversight kind of crashing down on us. This is us saying we just want to pull the product from shelves and, offer customers money or an exchange or something like that to maintain the relationship. So I think there's parts of product recalls that are inevitable. What you really don't want, though, is a federal government-driven or enforced product recall. So in the US, at least, there's a governing body called the Consumer Product Safety Commission, the CPSC, which is responsible for oversight of product safety as products get into consumers' hands. What you don't want is a product recall driven by the CPSC or in regulated and formulated product categories by someone like the FDA. That's something you really don't want. So this is ultimately kind of the way to think about product recalls. Like, I don't think they're ever great, but they're part of reality. It's just the really big, hairy ones that become press nightmares. And now, it's not just a operations or manufacturing problem. It's a marketing problem. It's a brand problem. It's a company problem. If you're a publicly traded company, it's a stock price problem. So that's the way to ultimately think about quality.
Well, I feel like we learned a ton here. Thank you so much for your time today, Prince. Yeah, appreciate you joining us.
Of course, man. Thanks for having me.
Thanks to everyone listening. If you want to learn more about Factored Quality, we'll be dropping links to them and anything we discussed in the show notes. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Blue Ocean. Blue Ocean is produced by StartOps, a growing collection of resources for operations leaders at e-commerce brands. A few of the things we built include a growing, vendor-free Slack community for operators to ask their most important questions and get answers from trusted peers, a job board that curates jobs from 1,500 modern brands, a media hub that includes this podcast, as well as articles and templates on a variety of operations topics, and a comprehensive directory of the software and services used by our community members. If you want to learn more, head to startops.network. And to keep up with the latest information from StartOps or catch the most recent episodes of Blue Ocean, follow the StartOps page on LinkedIn or subscribe to our newsletter. Thanks for listening and hope to catch you next episode.